The evening in Mapalo Village had started quietly, with the smell of nshima and stew filling the small courtyard where the family gathered for dinner. Relatives sat on wooden stools, laughter and chatter mixing with the sound of crickets outside. Mwiza, dressed in her neat but simple chitenge, passed plates around the table, smiling shyly as she always did. She felt safe in the familiar rhythm of family, until her brother Chanda's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You're not family," he shouted, his face twisted with anger. The room fell silent. The clatter of spoons stopped, and all eyes turned to Mwiza. For a moment she thought she had misheard him, but his glare confirmed it. Her chest tightened, her hands trembled, and the plate she was holding slipped, spilling food onto the floor. Relatives exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered under their breath, others stared down at their bowls as if hiding from the storm. Mwiza's eyes filled with tears she fought to hold back, but the shame pressed too heavily. She lowered her head, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Every word from Chanda echoed inside her like a cruel drum. "Did you hear me?" Chanda continued, his voice rising. "You don't belong here." Mwiza's lips parted, but no words came. Her throat was dry, her heart heavy. She looked toward her father, hoping for a defense, but he avoided her gaze. The silence hurt more than Chanda's words. Tears slid down her face as she realized she was standing alone in the middle of her own family's table. Long before that painful night at the dinner table, Mwiza had always believed that Chanda was her shield in this world. As a little girl, she followed him everywhere, her small hand clinging tightly to his as they walked down the dusty paths of Mapalo Village. He was taller, stronger, and carried himself with the kind of confidence she admired. To Mwiza, he was not just her brother, he was her hero. They would walk to school together in the early mornings, their bare feet brushing against the cool soil. Sometimes the journey was long and tiring, but Chanda always found a way to make her laugh. He would point out funny shapes in the clouds or tease her gently when she carried her books clumsily. When Mwiza grew tired, he would slow down so she could keep up. If older boys tried to tease her, Chanda would step forward with a stern face and chase them away. Mwiza never doubted that he would always protect her. At home, their bond was just as strong. Food was not always enough in the household, but whenever Chanda had an extra piece of sweet potato or roasted maize, he would split it in half and press it into Mwiza's hand. "Eat, you need it more," he would say, grinning as though it cost him nothing. She would eat happily, her heart warm with gratitude, believing no one in the world could ever care for her more. On rainy days, when water dripped from the roof into little tins, they would sit close together, making up stories to pass the time. Chanda's voice was always dramatic, acting out the parts of warriors and kings, while Mwiza would giggle until her stomach hurt. Sometimes, when she had nightmares, she would creep into his corner of the room. Without a word, he would make space for her, pulling an old blanket over her small body until she drifted back to sleep. Even when they quarreled, as children often do, it never lasted long. If Mwiza cried, Chanda would awkwardly pat her head and find some way to make her smile again. Their world, though small and simple, felt whole because they had each other. As Mwiza grew older, she carried those memories like treasures. They were proof that love had once been real between them, that family had once meant safety. That is why his words at the dinner table cut so deep. The brother who used to share his food, who once held her hand on the way to school, now looked at her as if she were a stranger. The boy who once protected her had become the man who wounded her most. For Mwiza, the betrayal was not only about being told she didn't belong, it was about losing the person she had trusted all her life. The whispers had been there for as long as Mwiza could remember. At first, she thought they were just the usual gossip of the village, the kind that rose and fell like the wind. But over the years, the words seemed to follow her everywhere, soft voices that turned sharp when she walked by. Some relatives would lean close to each other and murmur, "She doesn't look like the rest of them." Others would comment on her lighter skin or the shape of her face, pretending it was a joke. Mwiza would pretend not to hear, but every word settled in her chest like a stone. Her stepmother, Leia, never tried to hide her feeling. When food was being served, Mwiza's portion was always smaller. If there was meat, she got the piece with more bone than flesh. When clothes were given out, Mwiza received the second-hand ones that had already been worn thin, while Chanda and the others got newer, better ones. If chores were to be done, Leia always found extra work for her, saying, "You are the girl, you should do more." Mwiza would quietly obey, even when her back ached and her hands were sore. Still, she never let herself believe the whispers. She convinced herself that Leia's harshness was just a mother's strictness, that the gossip of the relatives was meaningless. What mattered most to her was Chanda. As long as her brother treated her like family, she could ignore everything else. But the whispers did not stop. At weddings, funerals, and even church gatherings, people found ways to remind her that she was different. Some would ask, half joking, "Are you sure you're really Bwalia's child?" Mwiza would force a smile, her heart pounding, and walk away. Later, when When she was alone, she would study her face in a small cracked mirror, searching for answers she didn't want to find. Did she truly look so unlike her father? The doubts grew slowly, like weeds in a garden. Mwiza tried to push them down, to bury them under her memories of childhood love and belonging. But then came Chanda's outburst at the family dinner. His voice, full of anger and certainty, broke through every wall she had built to protect herself. "You're not family," he had shouted. Those words were heavier than all the whispers she had heard before, heavier than the years of unfair treatment from Leia. For the first time, Mwiza could no longer dismiss the rumors. If her own brother, the one who once stood by her side, now rejected her in front of everyone, maybe there was truth in what people had been saying. Her heart ached as she realized that the shame she had tried to ignore was not just in the eyes of others. It had begun to live inside her. The seeds of doubt had finally taken root, and no matter how much she wanted to deny it, she could feel them growing. After that painful dinner, the family could not escape the tension. The air in the house felt heavier, and even the smallest conversations turned stiff. Relatives who once joked freely now spoke in hushed tones, careful not to upset anyone. It was during one of these uneasy evenings that Mwiza's cousin, Mwiza, finally broke the silence. "We can end all this talk," Mwiza said firmly, looking around the room. "Let's do a DNA test. That way, no one will ever doubt again." The words hit the family like a stone thrown into still water. Mwiza's heart skipped. She had never thought of such a thing, but the idea carried both hope and fear. What if the test cleared her name once and for all? But what if it confirmed the worst of her fears? Chanda reacted immediately, his voice sharp. "There's no need for that nonsense. We already know she doesn't belong." His jaw tightened, and his eyes narrowed at Mwiza. But Mwiza would not back down. "If you are so sure, then prove it. Let the test speak. After that, no one will need to argue again." Chanda fell silent, his pride fighting against his doubt. He wanted victory, wanted to stand tall in front of the family. Slowly, he leaned back and crossed his arms. "Fine," he said with a bitter smile. "Let's do it. Then everyone will see the truth." Mwiza sat quietly, her stomach twisting. She had no choice but to agree. It was her name, her place in the family, that was being questioned. Even though fear knotted inside her, she managed to nod. "Yes," she whispered. "Let's do it." The days that followed felt endless. Every relative seemed to walk on edge, whispering even more than before. Leia, Mwiza's stepmother, moved around the house with a hidden smile, as if she already knew how things would end. Father Bwalya, on the other hand, avoided Mwiza's eyes. He seemed older, his face lined with worry, yet he said nothing to stop the process. When the samples were taken and sent away, the waiting began. The silence in the home became almost unbearable. At mealtimes, the clatter of spoons was louder than the voices. Conversations died quickly, replaced by uneasy glances and heavy sighs. Outside, the gossip spread like wildfire through the village. Neighbors whispered about the family war, shaking their heads and wondering what truth would soon come out. For Mwiza, every hour felt like a test of strength. She tried to go about her chores, tried to keep her head high, but inside she was restless. At night, sleep refused to come. She would lie awake, staring at the roof, asking herself questions with no answers. Would she finally be free of shame, or would she lose everything she had ever called home? The whole family, and even the village, now waited for one envelope, an envelope that carried the power to break or rebuild her life. The days after the DNA test felt like a storm hanging over the house. Everyone was waiting, yet no one wanted to say it out loud. It was as if the walls themselves carried the weight of the silence. In the middle of it all was Leia, Mwiza's stepmother. On the surface, she moved around like nothing was happening, serving food, sweeping the yard, and chatting with visitors. But behind her calm face, there was a secret satisfaction. Each time she glanced at Mwiza, her lips curled into a faint smile that never reached her eyes. She wanted this test to prove what she had always whispered to others, that Mwiza did not belong in her home. In her heart, she hoped the results would push the girl away for good. Father Bwalya was the opposite. He looked like a man carrying a heavy stone on his back. Whenever Mwiza tried to meet his eyes, he turned away. At mealtimes, he would chew slowly, staring into his plate, his silence louder than words. Sometimes, late at night, Mwiza would hear him pacing in the yard, his footsteps restless on the ground. He seemed torn between protecting his daughter and avoiding the truth he feared might come out. His distance cut Mwiza deeply. She needed his voice, his assurance, but all she got was silence. Meanwhile, the community outside the home was alive with gossip. In Mapalo Village, secrets never stayed hidden for long. Women fetching water at the borehole whispered about the family drama, shaking their heads with wide eyes. Men sitting under mango trees laughed and speculated about who was the real child in the Bwalya household. Even children, picking up the fragments of adult conversations, teased each other with chants about not belonging. Everywhere Mwiza went, she felt eyes following her, heavy with curiosity and judgment. Inside the home, the tension spread like smoke. Chanda grew more impatient, walking around with an air of triumph, as if he had already won. He smirked at Mwiza, sometimes muttering under his breath, "Soon it will be over." His words pierced her, but she stayed quiet, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Mwiza tried to keep her head high, but each day chipped away at her strength. She carried out her chores, swept the compound, cooked meals, and fetched water, but she felt like a shadow in her own home. The waiting was worse than the whispers. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing if the ground beneath her would hold or crumble. Even the smallest moments became tense. A dropped spoon at dinner would make everyone flinch. A cough in the middle of a conversation would be met with silence. No one could escape the storm. The family was bound together by blood and history, yet in those days they felt like strangers living under the same roof. All of them were waiting for that envelope, and with it, the truth that could either break them apart forever or piece them back together in ways none of them expected. The night of the dinner felt heavy from the very beginning. Relatives from near and far had gathered, filling the compound with voices, footsteps, and the clatter of plates. The table was set more formally than usual, with a large pot of nshima steaming in the center, bowls of vegetables, and roasted chicken, meant to give the evening a sense of dignity. But beneath the smell of food, there was a sharp tension no one could ignore. Everyone knew why they were there. The envelope sat on the table, sealed and untouched. No one wanted to be the first to mention it. Laughter sounded forced, conversations stumbled, and the air felt thick. Mwiza sat quietly at one end, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart racing. Across from her, Chanda leaned back in his chair, smirking as if the results were already written in his favor. Each time his eyes met hers, they carried the same cruel message: "You're finished." Finally, one of the elders, a respected uncle with a stern voice, cleared his throat. "We cannot continue pretending. The time has come to open the envelope." His words silenced even the clinking of spoons. All eyes turned to Father Bwalia, who sat stiff, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for the envelope. The sound of the paper tearing filled the room, louder than the crackle of the fire outside. Mwiza's chest tightened as she held her breath. Bwalia unfolded the paper slowly, his eyes scanning the words. His lips parted, but no sound came out. "Read it," Chanda demanded, his voice dripping with impatience. The elder took the paper from Bwalia's shaking hands and read aloud. "The results confirm. Mwiza is the biological daughter of Bwalia." The words hit the room like thunder. Mwiza gasped softly, her eyes widening as tears welled up. The shame, the whispers, the years of doubt, all of it seemed to lift in a single moment. Relief flooded her heart. But before she could breathe fully, the elder continued. His voice grew heavier. "As for Chanda, he is not the biological son of Bwalia." Silence. Utter silence. The air seemed to freeze. Chanda's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by shock. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at the elder, then at Bwalia, then back at the paper as if it had betrayed him. The silence broke in a wave of chaos. Relatives gasped loudly, some covering their mouths, others whispering frantically. Chairs scraped against the floor as people leaned forward, their voices rising in disbelief. "What? How can this be?" someone exclaimed. Chanda's fists slammed against the table, rattling the plates. "This is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking. Mwiza, still trembling, pressed her hand to her mouth, caught between relief and heartbreak for her brother. Bwalia sat frozen, his face buried in his hand. Leia, the stepmother, stiffened in her chair, her lips tight but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. What was meant to be a dinner of answers had turned into a storm of truth, shaking the foundation of the family. The noise around the table slowly died down, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the crackle of the fire outside. All eyes turned to Father Bwalia, who still sat with his head in his hand. His shoulders shook slightly, as if the weight of years had finally crushed him. When he finally lifted his face, his eyes were red, his voice low and broken. "There is something I should have said a long time ago," he began, his words trembling. "Something I should never have hidden." He paused, looking at Mwiza, then at Chanda, his lips pressed tight as though speaking caused him pain. "Before I married Leia," he said slowly, "I loved another woman. Her name was Tamara. She was gentle, strong, and kind. Mwiza, she was your mother." The room went silent again, everyone holding their breath. Mwiza's chest tightened. The name of her mother, long gone, filled her with both warmth and sadness. Bwalia's eyes softened as he looked at her. "You are my blood. You are my daughter, Mwiza. I should have stood by you openly, but I failed you. I let silence cover the truth." Mwiza's tears spilled over. Her heart ached, but for the first time in years she felt seen. She was not a stranger, not an outsider. She belonged. Then Bwalia turned to Chanda. His voice grew heavier. "Chanda, you are not my blood." The words cut the room like a knife. Chanda's face twisted, confusion and rage fighting inside him. "What are you saying?" he demanded, his voice cracking. Bwalia swallowed hard. "When I met Leia, she was already a mother. You were her son from another man. I chose to raise you as my own. I gave you my name, my home, my care. But the truth is, you are not my biological child." Gasps filled the room. Some relatives covered their mouths in disbelief, while others shook their heads as if refusing to accept what they were hearing. Chanda stared at Leia, his voice trembling with anger. "Mother, you knew? You knew all this time." Leia's hands clutched her lap tightly, her face pale but her eyes steady. "Yes," she admitted, her tone cold and defensive. "I knew. I thought it was better this way. I wanted you to have a father's name, a place in this family. I never thought this day would come." Chanda's chair scraped loudly as he pushed back, his body shaking. "You lied to me. All my life you lied." His voice cracked as tears filled his eyes. The room was heavy with grief and betrayal. Secrets buried for years had risen to the surface, tearing apart everything they thought they knew. Mwiza sat frozen, her heart breaking not only for herself but for her brother, who now looked lost in a truth too heavy to carry. Chanda's chest rose and fell quickly, his face red with anger and disbelief. His fists trembled on the table, but then the strength seemed to drain from his body all at once. He staggered back, his chair tipping over, and sank to the floor. His shoulders shook violently, as if the weight of the truth had crushed him. "All my life," his voice cracked, raw and broken. "All my life I thought I was the true son. I thought I was the one who belonged. I mocked her, I pushed her away, and now," his words choked in his throat, replaced by sobs that filled the room with a pain no one could ignore. Relatives sat frozen, unsure of what to do. Some looked at him with pity, others with unease, but no one moved. It was Mwiza, the one he had hurt the most, who rose from her seat. Her own heart was heavy, but her steps were steady as she walked toward him. She knelt down beside her brother, her eyes shining with tears. "Chanda," she whispered softly, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. He tried to push her away at first, shame burning in his eyes, but she held firm. "You are still my brother. Blood or not, you are still my family." Her words broke something inside him. He covered his face with his hands, crying like a lost child. "I was cruel to you," he confessed, his voice shaking. "I told you that you didn't belong. And now it's me who doesn't belong." Mwiza's tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "No, you belong. You always will. Nothing can change that." She pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as if to shield him from the storm of shame and pain. The relatives around the table watched in silence, some wiping tears from their own eyes. The very girl who had carried years of rejection and humiliation was now the one offering comfort. Her strength shone through the cracks of heartbreak, brighter than anyone had expected. Father Bwalia sat motionless, guilt etched deeply into his face. Leia looked away, unable to meet her son's eyes. The family was torn apart, secrets spilling like water that could never be gathered back. Yet in the middle of the chaos, Mwiza stood as the thread holding them together. Chanda clung to her, his sobs softening into quiet whimpers. For the first time, he saw her not as an enemy, but as the sister he had always needed. Mwiza's embrace was steady, her voice low and gentle as she whispered, "We will get through this. Together." In that moment, the roles had shifted. The girl once treated as an outsider was the one showing true belonging. The boy who thought he was strong now leaned on her for strength. And though the family was fractured, Mwiza's heart rose above the pain, proving that love could survive even the deepest wounds. The days after the truth came out were heavy and confusing. The family moved like shadows in the same house, each person lost in their own thoughts. Chanda kept mostly to himself, ashamed and quiet, while Leia avoided Mwiza's eyes more than ever. Father Bwalia tried to speak, but his words often died in his throat. The home that once buzzed with voices now sat under a cloud of silence. But Mwiza refused to let that silence break her. She had carried pain for years, pain that had shaped her, but she realized now that she was stronger than all the whispers, stronger than all the cruel words. Instead of letting bitterness take root, she chose a different path. Slowly, with patience, she began to stitch the broken pieces of her family back together. She started with Chanda. Though he was still drowning in shame, she never stopped treating him with kindness. She would bring him food without a word, sit near him even when he pushed her away, and remind him gently, "You are my brother." Bit by bit, his anger softened into something more fragile, and he began to accept her comfort. With her father, she showed quiet forgiveness. When Bwalia finally gathered the courage to apologize, Mwiza only nodded with tears in her eyes. "I understand," she said softly. Her grace lifted some of the guilt from his shoulders, and for the first time, he dared to look her in the eyes without shame. Even with Leia, who had been her harshest critic, Mwiza showed no hatred. Though the stepmother's pride kept her distant, Mwiza treated her with respect. She did her chores without complaint, greeted her politely, and offered help when needed. Over time, the coldness in Leia's face began to crack, replaced by a quiet unease. It was as if Mwiza's kindness left no room for hatred to grow. Outside the walls of their home, the village watched closely. At first, the gossip only grew louder. People whispered about the scandal, about the son who was not truly a son, and the daughter who had been rejected for so long. But as days turned to weeks, something began to change. Instead of breaking down, Mwiza rose higher. She walked through the village with her head lifted, not in arrogance, but in quiet dignity. She greeted those who had mocked her, offered help where she could, and carried herself with grace. The same people who once laughed behind her back now began to speak differently. "That girl is strong," they said. "She has a heart of gold." Her resilience silenced the gossip more than anger ever could. In her strength, Mwiza became a light not just for her family, but for the whole community. She showed that truth, though painful, could lead to healing. She proved that forgiveness was stronger than bitterness, and that love could grow even in broken soil. Through her, the family slowly began to mend, and the village learned to admire the girl they had once doubted. The sun was setting when the family gathered once more for dinner. This time, the air was different. There was no envelope on the table, no whispers hanging like smoke. The villagers had been invited too, curious to see how the family would face each other after everything that had been revealed. Pots of food were passed around, children laughed in the background, but everyone's eyes kept drifting toward Chanda. He sat quietly, his head bowed, his hands fidgeting in his lap. For days, he had carried the weight of shame, but tonight he stood slowly, his chair scraping against the ground. The table fell silent. His voice shook as he began. "I need to say something." He paused, looking at Mwiza with eyes full of regret. "All my life, I called you an outsider. I humiliated you. I made you cry. But I was blind. You are my true sister." His voice cracked, and tears slipped down his cheeks. "Please forgive me." Mwiza's eyes blurred with tears. She rose to her feet and walked to him. Without hesitation, she wrapped her arms around him. The sight of the two siblings holding each other after so much pain sent a wave of emotion through the crowd. Relatives wiped their eyes, villagers whispered softly, some even sobbing quietly. Father Bwalya stood too, placing his arms around both children. Even Leia, with tears glistening on her cheeks, joined the embrace. For the first time in a long time, the family felt whole. The villagers watched, moved by the scene. The story of rejection, truth, and forgiveness had ended not with division, but with unity. And in that moment, everyone saw the power of love rising above shame.